frequency. How often should I stimulate my glutes, my shoulders, my biceps? And the answer to that is, based on the evidence that we have, we know that 1 time per week is not enough. So you need to hit each body part more than once per week. What we don't know is 2 better than 4? Is 5 better than 3? All of the research that compares how often we should hit each body part, it's kind of, there's not a consensus yet. The only consensus we can say is, if you're only hitting chest once per week, that is not ideal. It needs to be at least twice. But again, if you want to lift 4 times per week per body part, research would suggest that's not any better or worse than 2 times. The only thing we want to stay away from is just 1 time per week. So those are the 4 variables that you at least need to be considering when you're doing your resistance training program. How much weight, what's the intensity, and the volume.
Yeah, that's awesome information. And I want to unpack some of that stuff just to deep dive a little bit more for the listeners. And we'll come back to load. So if we're looking at, and the way I traditionally interpret load is percentage of 1RM.
Okay, we can use that.
That's where my mind automatically goes, right or wrong. Now, if we're looking at load for, say, fat loss, I know for strength and power, definitely the percentage of 1RM or the intensity is going to definitely go up. From my experience, it really needs to be over 88% to get any kind of profound neurological changes with more intermediate to advanced clientele. But what type of load, like if we're looking at that variable first, what type of load are we thinking? Like for a general fat loss hypertrophy client, because ultimately they're the same, right? Like you're building muscle, which increases RMR and all that type of stuff and drops body comp over time. What percentage would you be thinking?
So I'm gonna suggest a percentage of 1RM that's probably around 80%. So if I say 80%, where does your mind go in terms of how many reps would they be able to complete?
Look, 80%, 8 out of 10, kind of anywhere from 8 to 12 reps.
Okay. So the reason I like that range is because when we look at the mechanism of muscle hypertrophy, we have 2 main things driving this. The first one is mechanical tension. So we want to get as much tension on these myofibrils, these actin and myosin fibrils. So tension, we get that with load. The other thing that impacts or that has a role in the mechanism of muscle hypertrophy is something called metabolic stress. So think of this as essentially a lack of oxygen supply to the muscle.
So could I interpret that as tension and time?
Yeah, I love that actually. Yeah, so tension and time.
Yeah.
Because when you're doing more reps, that set's going to last longer.
Yeah.
Now, I would caution against purposefully trying to go very, very slow on your concentric portion. I can get into that if you want. But the metabolic stress, think of that as the more reps you do in a set, and you're getting that lactic acid. So lactic acid is essentially you don't have enough oxygen to take on these electrons, and eventually that lactate is formed. So this 8 to 12 repetition range, or this 75 to 80 to 85% of 1RM, what that's doing is that's allowing us to kind of hit the sweet spot where we're getting the benefits of relatively heavy weights. That's the mechanical tension part of this.
Yeah.
But it's allowing us to do enough repetitions where we're also tapping into this metabolic stress compartment of the mechanism of muscle hypertrophy. So it's the sweet spot. So in Physique Coaching Academy, we suggest the majority of your training should be in that 80% or 8 to 12 repetition range. And then if for nothing else other than to prevent just boredom or for psychological reasons, have some days where you're lifting heavier loads and some days where you're actually going lighter. And again, now not just for psychological benefit, but now we're leaning into the mechanical tension part of this, let's say 20% of the time. And then the other maybe 20% of the time, we're leaning into this metabolic stress. So we're covering all bases. And I would say I've done multiple resistance training studies in my research lab, and we've gotten the best muscle hypertrophy results when we do a 60%, 80% 1RM or 8 to 12 rep range, and then 20% heavier weights, 85 to 90, 95% of 1RM. And then the other 20% of the time, 70, 75% of 1RM, when we're getting about 15 to 20 reps in a given set. Always training to near failure. That's got to be kind of a prerequisite.